Welcome to the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in critical times. Here's your host, Bill Kelly.
Welcome to another edition of the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in these very critical times. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. Good to have you with us today. The question on everybody's minds these days as we look at what's happening from Trump in Washington and what's happening with our own economy right now is, are we moving in the right direction? Is Prime Minister Carney taking us down the right road? And maybe even more importantly, are we doing it fast enough? Well, it's not a simple yes or no answer to that. There's a lot of complexity involved in this. Let's try to get into some of that stuff in the podcast for today. First of all, are we moving in the right direction? I say yes, and I think many of the economists, most of the economists that have been watching Mark Carney since he became Prime Minister, are in agreement with the direction that's happening. And by the way, this is not breaking new ground here. I know some people are saying, well, this is conservative light. You know, this is really just what Poilievre wanted to do. Well, we'll take that with a grain of salt. But this is the way this country used to be run when it was doing well. And you don't have to go back too deeply into history here right now to Jean Chrétien's government. Chrétien, of course, followed Brian Mulroney in the prime minister's role. Mulroney, nice guy, did a lot of great stuff for the environment, but not a great money handler, quite frankly. I mean, we were in terrible financial shape after the Mulroney government, 2 terms of the Mulroney government, to the point where the World Banks and others were simply saying, guys, Canada, better get your act together. You're in deep trouble. Well, Chrétien and his finance minister, Paul Martin, back in the early 90s, mid-1990s, did some pretty drastic stuff to try to do this, to get Canada back on track right now. And it worked. They encouraged energy development in the West. Yes, a liberal government encouraging that sort of thing. That's not a new conservative idea. Chrétien and his team actually moved that ahead to great success to try to get that energy sector going. They balanced the budget. It took a lot of hard work, a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. A lot of civil service workers were pissed off about that. He got spending under control. And they actually cut personal and business taxes in a course of time, too, once they kind of got the ship steadied here. So it was a long process and not without pain. And just as Carney is promising us now, that there's going to be some price to pay for this. But it worked. And Carney seems to be going down the same road, and good for him that this is what this country needs to do. I mean, after 10 years of Justin Trudeau, and we've talked about some of those numbers, it's about time that we got our financial and economic act back together again. I know a lot of these numbers that you hear and that we even talk about here on the podcast from time to time, kind of make our eyes gloss over, like, what are you talking about here? Like GDP and the percentage of this and everything else. Well, just take from this that, it's good news, okay? Social programs, even during those cuts that the Chrétien and Martin governments made, might have sounded severe, but social programs, for the most part, stayed intact. The things that Canada and Canadians needed were still there. As a matter of fact, that happened to a large extent under the Harper government, too. I mean, there are some things that are sacrosanct and still need to be happening, and that's good. But the federal tax burden was an interesting story, too. It fell from 17.4% when Mulroney was the prime minister, down to 14% under the Chrétien-Martin team, which was exceptional and got us back on track. Just, by the way, to give you some perspective on that, it rose dramatically under the Trudeau government by about 78%, actually, down to 51% and then back up again. So I know the numbers are kind of staggering. You say, well, what's the relevance? The fact is we had our finances under control under the Chrétien government. The Trudeau government, not so much. It just kind of ballooned, and we're paying the price for that, as we expect is going to happen, right? Carney wants to stop that. He wants to change that around, and that's a good thing. But it's like trying to turn the Titanic around. You can't do it like this. It's going to take time, and it's going to take some effort, and it's not going to happen overnight. But we seem to be moving in the right direction, and that's a good thing. He's talking about, again, resource development and work with Alberta. Pipelines are in there. I know some people still feel uneasy about that, but when you've got a product like this that the world needs, you got to get it to market. And we haven't done a very good job of that. Under the Trudeau government, Trudeau's attitude seemed to be, hey, corporate, you should be thankful and happy that, you've got Canada here to share in this, instead of, looking, always giving and asking for stuff. And basically the corporate world just walked away from Canada and said, you don't know what you're talking about here. You need to bring those people back. And there has to be some cooperation and some partnerships. And the Canadian government under Carney seems to be working toward that, and that's a good thing. We do need to get that product to world markets, to Europe and of course, to Asia. And there seem to be some talks to get that going. It's going to take a while, but we'll see what happens there. The other element to this, though, that we've talked about considerably, and because we need to talk about this, is you can't talk about economic regrowth and development without getting into the American factor and the Trump factor here. It's one thing to say, okay, here's what we got right now, and yeah, boy, it needs fixing. It needs some major surgery. Uh, but to fix it, you first of all have to have a plan. And I think, as we just talked about, we seem to be developing that plan. But the wild card in this, of course, is Trump. I mean, trying to fix our economy and get it back so we're competitive here in the 21st century is a difficult enough task. Trying to do it when you got the madman in Washington basically whimsically deciding to impose tariffs or not this or that or cut this off or not have negotiations. It's like, trying to fix your car while you're driving down the 401 highway. You can't do it. I mean, you've got to be able to slow down and count on some things that are going to be there, and some stability. And there is no stability globally. There is no stability economically as long as Trump is in the White House. And he's not going away anytime soon. So how do you approach this? And I know the critics have looked at Carney and said, well, so much for elbows up. He backed down on the tax, on the digital service tax, which probably was going to get tossed anyway. And basically trying to get negotiations. Is he naive to suggest they can still get a deal done? I think it's way too soon to make that sort of a judgment. Them that don't like the Liberals or don't like Carney are going to obviously criticize him. But there are really no other options here. He can't throw up his hands and say to Trump, hey, you're a jerk. I don't want to deal with you. You have to deal with him, which is why the UK, which is why the European Union and others having to find deals with the U.S. government. It's not because they like Trump. It's because the U.S. economy is still the big dog here, and we have to be players in this. And that's, I think, evidenced by what we have done and what Carney has done since he's become prime minister. Yes, he has reached out to all those other areas, and we have increased trade with other partners. Some of them existing partnerships that we have enhanced, others looking for new partnerships, the European Union, some of those other countries. And we have increased our business dealings with them, and that's a good thing. But is it enough? Not yet. The overwhelming majority, I think something like still 61 or 62% of the stuff that we produce and send out of this country still goes to the United States. So they're still, the number one. It was higher than that, by the way. It was closer to 70, I think, not too long ago. So we are decreasing that, but not to the point where we become self-reliant. We still need the United States, which is why Carney still needs to make a deal of some sort with the United States when it comes to trade or free trade, as the case might be. But the concern here is that Trump keeps moving the goalposts. Every time we think we're getting close to a deal, he simply wakes up one day and decides, no, I'm going to do this now, or I'm going to impose a 25% tariff on this, or I don't, it was copper just a little while ago, and, it was steel and aluminum. And now, of course, he's still talking about the dairy industry and what he considers to be unfair practices, which, by the way, are bogus. All the accusations he's making about unfair practices and 400% tariffs are totally untrue. No element of truth to anything he's saying there, but his MAGA people buy everything he says, hook, line, and sinker. So if Trump says it's an unfair deal, and if he says American farmers are getting charged 400% tariffs, they believe it, even though there's no evidence to it because it's not happening. So it's very difficult to try to battle something like that. Even though you may have truth on your side, the truth doesn't seem to be the number one factor with an awful lot of the American people these days. The MAGA cult just simply believes everything that Trump says. And of course, not just I'm talking about the general population, but the other element to this, too, of course, is the Congress and the Senate, the little bobbleheads there that simply do whatever Trump wants, passing that beautiful bill that he talked about, the economic bill, which is going to crush certain segments of the American economy and really, really be detrimental to many, many Americans vis-a-vis healthcare, et cetera. They blindly simply passed it because they said, well, we want to please our master. And that's scary when you've got a cult-like following like that. So these are some of the extraneous factors that we in Canada can't control, but they are absolutely having an impact on our economic future and what we're trying to do vis-a-vis forging some sort of a partnership with our American friends. It makes it much more difficult to be able to do that when you've got a guy like Trump who simply changes his mind and fills himself with incorrect information. I don't know if he's ignorant about this or if he's simply deciding that, okay, I'm simply going to make stuff up, which seems to be with the indication, and because people are going to buy no matter what he says. But it's presenting a false narrative to the American people. And for those who simply say, well, you just wait. Now that they've passed that bill, once some of these small U.S. economies start to crumble in certain sections of the economy, they'll come around to thinking that this guy's an imposter and a blowhard. I'm not so sure that's going to happen. And even if it does, It's going to take a long time for that to filter down. And I know there are some critics that are also saying, well, just, rag the puck here because there are midterm elections coming up next year in 2026. And the Republicans will get wiped out of the Senate and the Congress and everything will be happily ever after. Well, a word of caution about that. First of all, if that were to happen, and I'm very doubtful that it will, but if it were to happen, the Democrats are just as protectionist, if not more protectionist, than the Republicans when it comes to these sorts of deals. So, don't think that, there's going to be a white knight riding down there that's going to say, hey, we've been unfair to Canada all this time. Let's try to make things even now. That's not necessarily going to happen. So there's going to be a protectionist element to the U.S. economy no matter what. And I have mentioned on previous podcasts, and I think it bears repeating here, I'm not even sure there are going to be midterm elections. Because what Trump has done here to basically validate his need to put tariffs on whatever he wants or sign executive orders is he has declared an emergency in the United States. He says, they're in crisis mode. The country itself is, under threat. And that gives him, he thinks anyway, license to do whatever he wants without having to go to the Congress or the Senate to gain approval. So even things that technically were not under the purview of the president, he's doing. And of course, nobody's stopping him down there. So, yeah, there are protections within their constitution, but protections and laws are only effective if they're enforced. And right now, they're not being enforced in the states. So those are all things that Carney cannot control. But they certainly do have an impact on the negotiations and the talks that are going on to try to forge some sort of a deal here. And I'd like to say, hey, just hang in there, guys. It's going to get better. It is getting better. But the problem we've got here right now is that, we're on the clock here. When you decide to make a monumental change in economic approaches, just globally, but also with the United States, yeah, it takes time to turn that ship around. But when you got a guy like Trump who's simply all of a sudden changing the landscape, changing the whole approach to this and doing it on a whim, how does that give you any foundation of consistency to try to move ahead? Well, the short answer is it doesn't, right? And that's what we're faced with right now. I mean, let's keep in mind that the very reason that we're having these discussions right now about trying to forge a new trade deal is because Trump, as soon as he took office for the second term, basically ripped up the existing CUSMA deal because he didn't like it anymore. Although when he signed it, it was him that signed it, called it the greatest trade pact in the history of the world. Now he all of a sudden doesn't think that. So you can't take the guy at his word. Even though they signed something, even though he vows to do something, he does not hold true to what he has said. He doesn't have any commitment to promises that he has made. It just depends on the mood he's in, I guess, that particular day. So we're up against it right now. I mean, I guess we can take some solace in the fact that it sounds like he's picking on Canada, and there's certainly an evidence to support that may well be the case, but it's happening to other countries too. And yes, we have to continue along the road that Carney has put us on right now. We still have to look to places like India and the European Union and Scandinavia and, of course, the East for those trade deals. We're never going to get it down to the equilibrium where it's going to say, hey, you know what? We don't need the United States anymore. That's going to take a monumental change, and it's going to take years. And we don't have years here. We've got, well, as we do this podcast right now, probably about another 2 weeks before that August 1st deadline. And that might even get moved. So that's the shifting sand that we're trying to base a foundation of an economic deal here. So it ain't easy being prime minister in this country these days, but we seem to have a guy who gets it and understands what needs to be done. And no, he doesn't shake his fist at Trump. And no, he doesn't make idle threats about, well, like Doug Ford said, let's shut off the electricity to the East Coast that we control. That's a very, very it's irresponsible to make threats like that. People would die if Canada did that, and we're not going to. But with this heat wave that's going on, people die because of heat exhaustion and so many different things in major American cities anyway, because a lot of them don't have air conditioning. You shut off the power, you're not only killing the economy, you're killing people. And that's never going to happen. But there are things that we can do. And I'm sure that those discussions are going on in Ottawa these days, too. Is it going to be dramatic? Is it going to bring America to its knees? No. Let's be practical about this. But we do have some tools at place. But I think the mindset that Carney has here, and I think it's the mindset that we all have to have here, is we have to exhaust every other opportunity first. And we're not there yet. And I know the critics are going to jump up and down, and columnists are going to write stuff in the right-wing media and the Sun newspapers and the Post and all those others because they just want to criticize. There's a couple of things we need to be thankful for. First of all is we don't have Pierre Poilievre leading this country right now, because I don't know what we'd be doing, because he just doesn't have that sense, that common sense. I don't think he could stand up to any of this. I don't think the guy had any valid ideas on how to deal with this. Carney has dealt with adversity, of course, in his previous commitments as Bank of Canada governor and, of course, Bank of England governor, and a great deal of work he's done in the G7 over the years, too. So he's been there, done that. Not as a prime minister, but he's been at the table, and he's had to be around the decision makers about this. So take solace in that. We're not where we want to be just yet, but we seem to be heading in the right direction. And we can only hope that at least we can move there with some capacity and some speed to try to get us ahead above water, because it's a very tenuous situation right now. And I know many Canadians are very concerned about the short term and long term. But you've got to have somebody that understands what's going on and has their hand on the till here to make sure that we're going in the right direction. And so far, that seems to be the case. But as we said at the beginning of this podcast, that could change by the time that this thing drops tomorrow and you're reading this or watching this. The whole different landscape could be in front of us right now because of some whimsical decision that Trump makes. So, and we'll see how our government responds to it. These are interesting times. They're frightening times, but at the same time, as I guess optimistic politicians will tell you, when we're in a crisis situation, there is also opportunity here. So let's see just how that's going to pan out over the next little while. That's it for this edition of the podcast. Thank you so much for being with us. You can catch us, of course, wherever you pick up on your podcasts. And we always include background information and other stories that kind of fill in some of the gaps here and give you more context for the discussion that's going forward. Thanks, as always, to Madeline Kelly for the great work putting this one together. I'm Bill Kelly. Until next time, stay in touch and stay informed.
Bill Kelly Podcast brought to you by Wizen's Law, personal injury lawyers. Listen, you didn't choose to get injured, but you can choose the right lawyer. Wizen's Law, 905-522-1102 or wizenslaw.com.